The lawyer slid 2 pieces of paper across the desk and said the words that would change everything. Your parents' estate consists of one asset, a ranch, 3,000 acres, deep in the high country, and it's yours now, both of you. What he didn't say, not right away, was that the ranch was drowning in debt, that the buildings were falling apart, that the cattle were down to skin and bone, and that every rancher within 50 miles had already told him the same thing when he tried to find a buyer. Nobody wants it. Burn it down and sell the land for scrap value. That was the advice. And the 2 boys sitting across from him, 17 and 15 years old, 3 weeks removed from burying both their parents, had nowhere else to go and nothing else left. So they took the deed anyway. This is the story of what happened next. And I promise you, by the end of it, you'll understand why people still drive out to that valley just to see the place with their own eyes. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what these 2 brothers pulled off, you need to understand exactly how bad things were when they started. Their names were Eli and Caleb. Eli was the older one, 17, quiet. The kind of kid who'd been fixing fences and hauling feed since he was old enough to walk without falling over. Caleb was 15, sharper with numbers, the kind of mind that couldn't help but count and calculate even when the world around him was falling apart. Their father had run a modest cattle operation out in a rugged stretch of frontier country, the kind of land that looks beautiful in photographs and absolutely brutal in person. Winters that came early and stayed late. Summers where the creek beds cracked open like dry riverbeds of clay. It was never an easy place to make a living, but their father had made it work. Barely, for almost 20 years. Then came the accident. A truck, a bad stretch of icy road, and both parents gone in a single night. No warning. No goodbye. Just a phone call to a neighbor, and then 2 boys standing in a hospital corridor trying to understand a version of the world that no longer made sense. In the weeks that followed, the reality of their situation set in hard and fast. There was no life insurance to speak of. There was no savings account with any real cushion. Their father had been quietly falling behind on loan payments for 2 years, borrowing against the ranch to cover bad seasons, medical bills, and equipment repairs. The bank held a lien on nearly everything. Relatives were sympathetic, but distant, both emotionally and geographically. And not one of them stepped forward with an offer to take the boys in. The state started making noise about foster placement, about splitting the brothers up since finding a home willing to take 2 teenagers at once was apparently harder than anyone expected. And then the lawyer handling the estate found the loophole that would keep them together. The ranch itself, land and structures, had been placed in a family trust years earlier, shielded from some of the debt, though not all of it. If the boys accepted the inheritance, deed and debt together, they would legally be considered established on their own property. With Eli, as the older brother, granted emancipated guardianship over Caleb. It wasn't a clean solution. It wasn't a safety net. It was a decision that came down to precisely 2 options: split up and disappear into a system that had no room for them, or walk into the wreckage of a dying ranch and try to survive it together. They chose each other. The day they arrived, back at the property, they stood at the edge of the gravel drive and just looked at it for a long time before either of them said a word. The ranch house itself, the one they'd grown up in, was still standing, but you could see where the roofline had started to sag on the north end. The barn closest to the house had a hole punched through its side from a storm 2 winters back that their father never got around to fixing. Fence lines sprawled out across the property in various states of collapse, some sections leaning so far over they were basically decorative at that point. And the cattle. God, the cattle. Maybe 40 head left down from what neighbors said used to be closer to 200, and every single one of them showing ribs through their hides, standing in mud, drinking from a stock tank that hadn't been cleaned in who knows how long. Caleb, 15 years old, looked at all of it and said the only thing that made sense in that moment: where do we even start? And Eli, who had spent the last 3 weeks trying to hold both of them together through sheer force of will, said something that would basically become the operating philosophy for the next year of their lives. We start with whatever's dying fastest. That first week was almost entirely about triage. Forget big plans, forget fixing the roof or repairing the fence lines. The boys' entire focus narrowed down to keeping the remaining livestock alive. They didn't have money for proper feed, so Eli spent 2 days going door to door to the handful of neighboring ranches, not asking for charity, but asking for work. He offered labor in exchange for hay, for grain, for anything that would put weight back on those 40 starving cattle. Some ranchers turned him away. A couple of them looked at this scrawny 17-year-old kid and basically laughed him off their property. But a few said yes. An older rancher named Walt Pruitt, who'd known their father for decades, agreed to trade feed for fence work, and that arrangement alone kept the herd from dying out completely during those first brutal weeks. Caleb, meanwhile, was doing something that would turn out to matter just as much, if not more, in the long run. He was going through paperwork, every scrap of it he could find in the house, in the old filing cabinet in what used to be their father's office, in boxes stacked in the mudroom closet. Bank statements, old receipts, deeds, correspondence. He was 15 years old, and he was trying to build a complete financial picture of exactly what they'd inherited, because he understood something that Eli, focused entirely on the physical survival of the ranch, hadn't quite gotten to yet. You can't fix what you don't understand. And what he found in those documents was sobering. The debt on the ranch, between the bank loan and unpaid supplier accounts and back taxes on the property, came out to just under $60,000. For 2 teenagers with no income and no assets beyond a collapsing ranch, that number might as well have been $60 million. But here's the thing about Caleb, and this becomes important later. He didn't just see the debt. He started making lists of every single structure on the property, every parcel of land, every piece of equipment, rusted or not, and he started asking questions that most people wouldn't think to ask. Why was this particular barn built where it was? Why did the original property lines, based on some of the older documents he found, extend further than the fencing suggested? Why did his father, in the last year of his life, start making trips out to the far end of the property, to an old structure nobody used anymore, according to a scribbled note in one of his ledgers? Little things. Threads that didn't mean much on their own. But Caleb was the kind of kid who pulled on threads. The first month was brutal in ways that are hard to fully capture. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from manual labor you're not prepared for, waking up every day with muscles you didn't know you had screaming at you, hands blistered and cracked from fence wire and shovel handles. There's a different kind of exhaustion that comes from grief, the way it creeps up on you at the worst possible moments. In the middle of mucking out a stall or hauling water, memories of their mother's laugh or their father's voice hitting them sideways when they least expected it. And then there's the exhaustion of simply being scared, all the time, about money, about the bank, about whether they were going to lose everything anyway, despite every ounce of effort they were pouring into this place. They fought, of course. Any 2 teenage brothers thrown into a situation like that were going to fight. Eli, older and more protective, sometimes made decisions unilaterally that frustrated Caleb, who wanted more say in things given how much time he was spending buried in the ranch's finances. Caleb, meanwhile, sometimes got so absorbed in his research and his ledgers that Eli felt like he was carrying the physical burden of the ranch alone. There was one fight, about 6 weeks in, that got loud enough that Walt Pruitt, driving past on the county road, actually stopped his truck to make sure nobody was hurt. It wasn't really about the specific thing they were arguing over that day, some disagreement about whether to sell off a piece of old equipment. It was about grief and fear finding an outlet in each other because there was nowhere else for it to go. But they didn't quit, and they didn't let the fight become a fracture. That night, after Walt drove off satisfied nobody was actually in danger, the brothers sat on the porch steps in silence for a long time, and then Eli said something simple. "We're all either one of us has left." And Caleb nodded, and that was basically the end of it. Not because everything was suddenly fine, but because both of them understood, even at 15 and 17, that the alternative to sticking together was unthinkable. By the second month, the immediate crisis of the starving cattle had stabilized, thanks largely to the deal with Walt Pruitt and a couple of other neighbors who slowly started warming up to the idea that these boys were serious. Ward travels in ranch country, and word was starting to travel that the 2 Hartley boys, that was the family name, weren't just squatting on their dead parents' land, waiting for the bank to take it. They were out there every single day, in every kind of weather, actually trying. With the livestock no longer in immediate danger, the brothers turned their attention to the buildings. And this is where Eli's philosophy of starting with whatever's dying fastest came back into play, applied now to structures instead of animals. The ranch house itself was priority one, since that sagging roofline on the north end was genuinely at risk of failing before the next heavy snowfall. They spent nearly 3 weeks on that roof alone, working with materials that were, frankly, whatever they could scrounge or afford, which wasn't much. Caleb had found a little bit of cash hidden in an old coffee can in the kitchen, maybe $400 total, their father's version of an emergency fund, and that went almost entirely to roofing materials. The barn with the storm damage came next, though repairing it fully was beyond their resources at that point. So they focused on stabilizing it enough that it wouldn't collapse entirely and take out whatever equipment and feed was stored inside. And then there was the old building. Every ranch property, like this, tends to have one. A structure older than everything else on the land, usually the original homestead building from whenever the property was first settled, long since replaced by newer construction, but never quite torn down. On the Hartley Ranch, this was a small, squat structure near the back edge of the property, close to where the land started climbing into rockier terrain. Their father had always called it the old cabin, and as far as either brother knew, growing up, nobody had used it for anything in decades except maybe storage. It had a reputation, the kind that develops around old buildings on isolated properties, as the place you didn't really go into, because the floor might not hold your weight and there wasn't anything in there worth the risk anyway. Except Caleb kept coming back to that scribbled note in his father's ledger, trips out to the old cabin multiple times in the last year of his life, noted with just a date and nothing else. No explanation. Their father hadn't been a man who wrote much in the way of personal reflection, so these were sparse entries. Functional, the kind of thing you write to remind yourself of something rather than to explain it to someone else. But the pattern bothered Caleb. Why would a man drowning in debt, working himself to exhaustion trying to keep a failing cattle operation afloat, make repeated trips to an abandoned storage building that, as far as anyone knew, held nothing but junk? He brought it up to Eli one evening, probably around the 10-week mark while they were eating dinner, which by this point in their lives had become a fairly grim rotation of whatever was cheapest and easiest to make in bulk. Eli was skeptical. He had a lot on his mind, quite literally everything else on the property competing for his attention, and an old cabin that hadn't been touched in years didn't feel like a priority. But Caleb pushed, in the quiet, persistent way that 15-year-olds who are convinced they're onto something tend to push, and eventually Eli agreed that once they had a free afternoon, they'd go take a look. That free afternoon came about a week later, a Sunday, overcast but dry, one of the rare stretches of time where nothing on the ranch was actively falling apart or starving or demanding immediate attention. The two brothers walked out together, maybe a mile and a half from the main house, out past the last stretch of fence line, into the section of the property where the ground started to rise and the grass gave way to scrub and rock. The cabin itself, when they reached it, looked exactly as unremarkable as its reputation suggested. Weathered wood, a roof that had partially caved in on one corner, a door hanging slightly off one hinge. It looked like the kind of building that existed purely because tearing it down would have cost more effort than leaving it alone. Eli pushed the door open, wood groaning against wood, and the two of them stepped inside, flashlights out even though it was daytime, because what little light came through the gaps in the roof and walls wasn't nearly enough. Inside was mostly what you'd expect. Old crates, rusted tools nobody had used in a generation, the accumulated debris of a building that had been a catch-all for unwanted things for longer than either brother had been alive, cobwebs thick enough to feel like walking through curtains, the smell of old wood and mildew and dust that had settled so deep into the floorboards it had basically become part of the structure itself. But then, Caleb's flashlight caught something in the back corner that didn't quite match everything else. A section of the floor where the old warped boards looked slightly different from the rest, the wood grain running a different direction, the gaps between boards a little too even, a little too deliberate. He crouched down and ran his hand along the edge, and Eli, Watching his brother's face change, came over to look too. It took them almost 20 minutes of careful prying, worried about damaging whatever was underneath, and worried in equal measure about the whole floor giving way beneath them. But eventually, they got one of the boards up. And beneath it was a cavity. Not large, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, lined with what looked like an old tarp, gone brittle with age. Inside that cavity was a metal box, a heavy, old-fashioned strong box, with a simple latch, no lock, like whoever put it there hadn't been worried about anyone finding it in the first place, because why would anyone bother searching under the floor of an abandoned cabin nobody used? They pulled it out into what little light there was, and Eli, hands shaking slightly, flipped the latch and opened it. I want to pause here for a second, because I know exactly what you might be imagining. Gold coins, cash, some kind of movie treasure chest moment, and I promise you, what these two brothers actually found was both less cinematic than that, and in the long run, far more valuable. Inside the box were papers, not money. Papers, folded carefully, protected from the worst of the moisture by a couple of layers of thick plastic sheeting that had been wrapped around them. Clearly with real intention, by someone who wanted these documents to survive. There were land surveys, old ones dating back multiple decades, some of them predating their father's ownership of the ranch entirely. There were handwritten letters. There was something that looked like a mineral rights document, formal and typewritten, with an official-looking seal at the bottom. And there was a small leather-bound journal, water-damaged at the edges but mostly legible, filled with handwriting that neither brother recognized as their father's. They sat right there on the dusty floor of that old cabin. For the next 2 hours, going through everything, piece by piece, and slowly, a picture started to come together that neither of them could have predicted. The journal, it turned out, belonged to their great-grandfather, the man who had originally homesteaded this land generations back, long before their father or even their grandfather had run cattle on it. And in that journal was a story that had apparently been buried, quite literally, for decades. Their great-grandfather, according to his own account, had discovered something on this land back when he first settled it. Not gold, nothing quite that dramatic, but evidence of a significant mineral deposit on the far northern section of the property, the rockier, less useful for grazing section that later generations of the family had basically ignored because it wasn't good for cattle. He'd had it informally assessed by a geologist friend passing through the territory at the time, and the assessment, preserved among the papers in that strongbox, suggested the deposit could be quite valuable if properly developed. But developing it would have required capital he didn't have, and more than that, according to his own journal entries, he'd made a decision that the land was meant to raise cattle and raise a family, not to be torn open and stripped for whatever sat underneath it. He wrote about it with a kind of stubborn old-fashioned conviction that the ranch was worth more to him whole than it would ever be worth broken apart and sold off in pieces. So he buried the paperwork quite literally under the floor of what was then still his primary residence, the very cabin his great-grandsons were now sitting inside of generations later, and he apparently told almost no one. There was a brief mention in the journal of telling his own son, their grandfather, about it, with instructions that the mineral rights should only ever be pursued if the family truly had no other choice, if the ranch itself was truly on the brink of being lost. Otherwise, he wrote, let it stay buried. Let the land be what it's supposed to be. Somewhere along the way, whether through their grandfather's own choices or simply the passage of time and imperfect memory, that knowledge had faded, until, apparently, their own father found some trace of it. Maybe an old family story half-remembered, maybe another document they hadn't found yet. Something that sent him out to this cabin, repeatedly, in the final year of his life, searching, digging, trying to confirm whether the story was true. Whether he ever found this exact strongbox, whether he ran out of time before he could, neither brother would ever know for certain. But the timing lined up in a way that gave both of them chills. Their father, drowning in debt, quietly researching a possible way out, and never getting the chance to use it. Now, before I go further, I want to be clear about something, because this part of the story often gets exaggerated or oversimplified when people hear about it secondhand. Finding old paperwork describing a mineral deposit is not the same thing as finding money. It's not the same as solving your problems overnight. What Eli and Caleb had, sitting on that cabin floor, was a lead, a possibility, a thread worth pulling, in the same way that scribbled ledger entry had been a thread worth pulling. Nothing more than that, not yet. But it was, without question, the single most significant piece of information either of them had encountered since their parents died. And it changed the entire trajectory of what came next. Not because it was a golden ticket, but because of what they chose to do with it. The first thing Caleb did, once they got back to the house that evening, was start researching mineral rights law, which turned out to be a genuinely complicated rabbit hole, especially for a 15-year-old with a spotty internet connection and no legal background. He learned over the following days that mineral rights on a property can sometimes be severed from surface rights, sold off separately, leased to companies, and that the entire arrangement depends heavily on old deeds, state law, and whether any previous owner had done anything to complicate the chain of ownership. He learned that some of the paperwork in that strongbox, particularly the original geological assessment, was old enough that it would need to be validated by a current professional before it meant anything at all in practical terms. An assessment done by a traveling geologist several generations ago, however detailed, wasn't going to be worth anything to a bank or a mining company without modern confirmation. Eli, for his part, understood something else. That, whatever this deposit turned out to be, actually developing it, if that's even what they wanted to do, was going to require money they didn't have, expertise they didn't have, and almost certainly partnership with people who did. And that terrified him, almost as much as it excited him, because he'd already learned in just a few short months of running this ranch how easily people could take advantage of two teenage boys with no one looking out for them. So they did something that, looking back, was probably the smartest decision either of them made in that entire first year. They didn't rush. They didn't run into town and start telling everyone what they'd found. They sat on it, quietly continuing the day-to-day survival of the ranch, while Caleb slowly, carefully, started making calls. The first call was to the same lawyer who had handled their parents' estate, a man named Robert Aldrich, who by this point had developed a genuine soft spot for these two boys, having watched them refuse every easy way out over the past several months. Aldrich, to his credit, didn't try to take advantage of the situation either. He listened to what they'd found, examined copies of the documents they brought him, and gave them advice that would prove to be exactly right. Get a modern geological survey done before you tell anyone else anything. Confirm what you actually have before you let word get out, because the moment people hear there might be a valuable mineral deposit on your land, you're going to have very interested parties showing up, and not all of them are going to have your best interests at heart. The problem, of course, was that a modern geological survey costs money, and money was the one thing these boys still didn't have much of. This is where Walt Pruitt, the neighbor who'd already been quietly helping them since those first desperate weeks, stepped back into the story in a meaningful way. When the brothers, cautiously, without revealing too much detail, mentioned they needed to raise some money for a professional assessment of part of the property, Walt didn't ask a lot of questions. He'd known their father for 25 years. He offered them an advance on future fence work, real work. They'd pay back with labor over the following months, enough to cover a basic survey. It took another 6 weeks to actually get a geologist out to the property, coordinating schedules, saving up the remainder of what they needed, and during that time, the ranch didn't stop needing them. If anything, this stretch of the story is where you really see how much these two brothers had grown into the responsibility that had been dropped on them. They were running cattle drives to move the herd to better grazing, repairing sections of fence line in whatever daylight they had left after school, because yes, they were still technically supposed to be attending school, a fact that added its own layer of exhaustion to every single day. Eli was up before dawn every morning, doing chores before the bus came. Caleb was doing homework by flashlight some nights, because the ranch house's electrical situation was, charitably, unreliable. There's something worth sitting with here, something that I think gets lost. When stories like this get compressed down into a highlight reel of the exciting parts, these two boys were still just kids. Caleb was 15. He should have been worrying about midterms and whatever 15-year-olds worry about, not mineral rights law, and geological surveys and whether a metal box buried under a cabin floor was going to be the difference between keeping their home and losing it. Eli was 17, an age where most of his classmates were thinking about college applications and driver's licenses and prom, while he was thinking about cattle mortality rates and loan repayment schedules. Neither of them got to have a normal adolescence during this period, and they knew it, and there were nights, more than either of them would probably ever fully admit to anyone outside their own conversations, where the weight of it all felt unbearable. But they kept going, day after day, week after week. And when the geologist finally came out to the property, spent 2 days surveying that rocky northern section of land, took his samples and made his measurements, and packed up his equipment, he told them it would be a few weeks before he had a full report ready. Those few weeks were, by the brothers' own later accounts, some of the longest of their entire lives, because by this point they understood exactly how much was riding on this. Not just the possibility of some dramatic windfall, but something more fundamental: confirmation, one way or another, of whether the story in that journal was true, whether their great-grandfather's careful decision to protect this land had actually preserved something valuable, or whether it was simply an old man's optimistic assessment that never amounted to anything real. When the report finally came back, Robert Aldrich called them into his office to go over it together, and I think it's worth describing what that moment was actually like, because it wasn't a movie moment. Nobody screamed with joy. Nobody fainted. The two brothers sat in cheap office chairs across from a lawyer's desk, and Aldrich read through the technical language of a modern geological survey, translating it as he went, and slowly, carefully, the actual scope of what they'd found came into focus. The deposit was real, it wasn't gold, and I want to be honest about that, because sometimes this story gets told with more sparkle than it actually deserves. What their great-grandfather had identified generations earlier was a substantial deposit of a valuable industrial mineral, one used in a range of manufacturing and construction applications, present in the rock formations across a significant portion of that northern section of the property. The modern survey, using techniques and equipment their great-grandfather's traveling geologist friend could never have dreamed of, confirmed not only that the deposit existed, but that it was larger and more accessible than the original assessment had suggested. Not infinite, not the kind of thing that makes you an overnight billionaire, but real, substantial, and valuable enough that, properly handled, it represented a genuine path forward for two boys who had been treading water for the better part of a year. Aldrich was very careful, in that meeting, to walk them through exactly what this did and didn't mean. It didn't mean cash in hand tomorrow. Developing a deposit like this, or more realistically, leasing the rights to a company equipped to develop it properly, was going to take time, negotiation, and legal structuring to make sure two teenage landowners weren't getting steamrolled by companies with far more experience and far more lawyers. But it did mean, for the first time since their parents died, that these two brothers had genuine leverage. They weren't just two kids clinging to a failing property anymore. They were sitting on an asset that people were going to want, which meant if they played it right, they could finally start paying down that crushing debt and maybe eventually build something real. Gord, of course, eventually got out, because it always does in small communities, and once it did, things moved fast in ways the brothers weren't entirely prepared for. Within a month of the survey results becoming known, at least 3 different companies had reached out, expressing interest in leasing the mineral rights. Some of the initial offers that came in were frankly insulting, clearly banking on the idea that 2 teenagers with no experience negotiating contracts would just take whatever was put in front of them out of desperation. Aldrich, along with a mineral rights specialist he brought in specifically to help navigate this process, made sure that didn't happen. There were weeks of back and forth, of the brothers learning in real time an entirely new language of contracts and royalty structures and environmental commitments, because part of what mattered to them, and this comes through clearly in how they eventually chose to handle things, was making sure whatever development happened on that land didn't destroy the rest of it in the process. Their great-grandfather had protected this place because he believed it was worth more whole than broken apart. And even facing the possibility of real financial security for the first time in their lives, the brothers found themselves thinking about that same balance. Eventually, they settled on an agreement with a regional company that had a track record of responsible extraction practices, one that limited the footprint of any mining operation to a defined section of that northern property, far from the grazing land and the buildings. With contractual requirements around land restoration once the operation eventually wound down, whenever that might be, years or decades in the future. The upfront signing payment alone was enough to clear every dollar of debt on the ranch, the bank loan, the back taxes, the unpaid supplier accounts, all of it gone in a single transaction that Caleb, ever the numbers person, later described as the single most surreal moment of his entire life. Watching a debt that had felt like an insurmountable weight for over a year simply disappear on paper. But it was the ongoing royalty structure that really changed the long-term picture. A steady, dependable stream of income, not extravagant, but real, flowing in on a regular basis, tied to the mineral extraction happening on that small section of the property. Enough to fund actual repairs, actual investment back into the ranch, in a way that had been impossible during those first desperate months of scraping by on borrowed feed and hoarded coffee and cash. And this is where the story shifts, I think, into its most satisfying chapter. Because what these two brothers did with that opportunity says a lot more about who they'd become than the discovery itself ever could. They didn't sell the ranch. Multiple people, once word got around about the mineral rights deal, approached them with offers to buy the property outright, figuring two teenagers freshly out from under crushing debt might want to just cash out and walk away from the whole difficult chapter of their lives. Ellie and Caleb turned down every single one of those offers without much hesitation. This was still their home, still the place their parents had built a life on, still the land their great-grandfather had first put down roots on generations earlier. The debt had been the enemy, not the ranch itself. Instead, they reinvested. Methodically, the same way they'd approached everything else since the day they first stood at the edge of that gravel driveway, looking at a property that everyone told them was worthless. They started with the barn, finally doing a proper full repair instead of the patchwork stabilization job they'd managed in those early months. They brought in a contractor to fix the ranch house roof properly, replacing the scavenged materials from that first desperate repair job with something built to actually last. They invested in the herd, buying quality breeding stock to slowly rebuild the cattle operation their father had run, this time on a foundation that wasn't buckling under debt. They fixed the fence lines, all of them, not just the sections that were actively failing. They repaired the old cabin, too, interestingly, not tearing it down despite its age and condition, but restoring it, in a strange way, honoring the building that had quite literally held the secret that saved their family's future. Today, from what's been reported, that cabin still stands on the property, repaired and preserved, something between a family monument and a reminder of exactly how close they came to losing everything before finding the one thing that changed the trajectory of their lives. Walt Pruitt, the neighbor who'd extended credit and trust to two teenage boys when he had no real obligation to do so, was among the first people the brothers made sure to properly repay. Not just a literal debt for the feed and the advance he'd given them, but with an ongoing friendship and partnership that, from accounts of people in that community, continues to this day. There's something worth noting in that, too. This wasn't a story where two kids got rich and forgot the people who helped them survive the hard years. If anything, the brothers became known in their community for exactly the opposite, for remembering, specifically and deliberately, everyone who extended them a hand when they had every reason not to. School, interestingly, continued to matter to both of them even after the financial pressure eased. Caleb, whose sharp analytical mind had basically taught itself contract law and mineral rights regulations out of pure necessity during the hardest stretch of this whole ordeal, ended up pursuing that interest formally, eventually studying agricultural business and law. Driven by an experience that had shown him firsthand exactly how vulnerable people can be when they don't understand the systems governing their own land and property. Eli stayed closer to the day-to-day operation of the ranch itself, the work he'd always been naturally suited to, gradually expanding the cattle operation back toward and eventually beyond what it had been in their father's best years. It would be nice to tell you that everything simply became easy after that geological survey came back, that the story wraps up in a clean bow with two brothers living happily ever after on a thriving ranch. Real life is rarely that tidy, and I think it does a disservice to what these two actually went through to pretend otherwise. There were still hard years ahead. Ranching, even well-funded ranching, is subject to weather and market prices and disease outbreaks and all the usual unpredictability that makes it one of the most difficult ways to make a living. The grief of losing their parents didn't simply resolve itself because a financial burden lifted by multiple accounts. Both brothers dealt with that loss in their own ways for years afterward, in ways that had very little to do with money at all. Grief doesn't care about your bank balance. But what they did have from that point forward was a foundation. Stability, the freedom to make decisions about their future based on what they actually wanted rather than what desperation forced them into. That distinction matters enormously, and I think it's the real heart of why this story resonates with people who hear it. Because here's the thing about the entire arc of what happened to Eli and Caleb Hartley. It would be easy, and honestly kind of lazy, to frame this whole story as being about the discovery in that cabin, buried treasure, hidden mineral rights, the lucky break that saved the day. But if you actually sit with the full timeline of what happened, the discovery in that cabin only mattered because of everything these two boys did before they ever found it. If they hadn't kept those 40 starving cattle alive through those brutal first weeks, there would have been no ranch left to save by the time they found the strongbox. If Caleb hadn't developed the habit, born entirely out of necessity, of digging through old paperwork trying to understand every angle of what they'd inherited, that scribbled ledger entry about trips to the old cabin would have meant nothing. Just an unremarkable detail lost among hundreds of other unremarkable details. If Eli hadn't spent months building trust with neighbors like Walt Pruitt, through nothing but consistent, honest, hard work, there would have been no one willing to advance them the money for that crucial geological survey. The treasure, if you want to call it that, didn't save these boys. Their own character, their own stubborn refusal to give up on each other or on the place their family had built, is what put them in a position for that discovery to matter at all. A different set of siblings, less careful, less patient, less willing to grind through months of exhausting, thankless labor, might have found that exact same strongbox and squandered the opportunity entirely, or never found it in the first place, because they'd already given up and sold off the property for whatever scrap value they could get. I think that's ultimately what makes this story worth telling and worth remembering, beyond just the surprising twist of what was hidden in that old cabin. It's a story about what happens when two people refuse to abandon each other, even when literally everyone around them, from distant relatives to the county lawyer to the neighboring ranchers who initially wanted nothing to do with the situation, expected them to fail. It's about the slow, unglamorous, exhausting work of rebuilding something from almost nothing. One fence post and one feed bill and one desperate calculation at a time. And yes, it's about the remarkable stroke of fortune that came from an old journal protected under the floorboards of a forgotten cabin by a great-grandfather who believed, decades before either of these boys were even born, that some things matter more than money, right up until the moment they don't. Today, from what limited public information has come out about the Hartley Ranch since this story first started circulating, the property is thriving in a way that would have seemed absolutely impossible to anyone standing at that gravel driveway on the day two grieving homeless teenagers first arrived, with nothing but a deed and each other. The cattle operation has grown well beyond where it stood even in their father's best years. The buildings are sound. The old cabin stands preserved at the edge of the property, a quiet monument to the discovery that changed everything, and an equally quiet monument to everything that had to happen before that discovery could mean anything at all. Eli and Caleb Hartley didn't inherit a fortune. Not really. What they actually inherited was a mess. A dying, debt-ridden, half-collapsed piece of land that every single adult who looked at their situation told them, in one way or another, to walk away from. What they built out of that mess, through a combination of relentless work, sharp thinking, quiet trust from a few good neighbors, and one genuinely extraordinary discovery buried under the floorboards of a building nobody had used in decades, is a story that reminds you what's actually possible when two people decide, against every reasonable expectation, that giving up simply isn't an option. Sometimes the thing that saves you has been sitting there the whole time, waiting patiently under the floor of the oldest, most overlooked corner of your life, put there generations ago by someone who believed, quietly and without any guarantee they'd ever be proven right, that the people who came after them would need it someday. All you have to do is be the kind of person who keeps looking hard enough and long enough to actually find it. And if you ask either of those brothers today what the real inheritance was, I don't think either one of them would point first to the mineral rights, or the royalty checks, or even the fully restored ranch house standing where a collapsing roofline once threatened to bring the whole place down. I think they'd point to each other, two boys who had every reason in the world to be pulled apart by grief and fear and a system that wanted to split them up, who chose instead to stay exactly where they were, on land nobody else wanted, and build something worth having, together. If this story moved, you stick around, because there are more stories just like this one, waiting for you, ordinary people facing impossible odds and finding their way through. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.